Hey, what's up everybody? It's Rutech. Today we'll be talking about the best $1,000 interim gaming PC for April of 2021. So in this video, I'm giving my own parts selections for a specific price range, but perhaps you have a different smaller or bigger budget, or you're looking for something with different specific features and want a more personalized recommendation from a highly trustworthy source. Well, there's this new and upcoming free shopping tool called Lustre. It's a free Chrome extension that gives you exactly that. Not only does it find and analyze trusted expert reviews, but it also brings up discussion forums mentioning products, like on Reddit or video reviews on YouTube. Let me give you guys a little demo. So I'm looking for the best CPU for around $500, so it gives me the top 5 CPUs for that exact price range. And it backs up exactly why they're the top 5 with tons of info and data. Let's take a look at what they tell me about the i9-10900K. It compares a bunch of 1 to 10 scores from multiple trustworthy websites such as PC Mag, PC Gamer, Windows Central, Tom's Hardware, etc. And then right below that, it shows me all the tech specs, which I really like. The point is, you're going to be saving a lot of time and money using Lustre. Link to get Lustre is in my description. So here's the deal with this PC. It, as you can probably tell, does not have a beefy graphics card, but let me explain why. As you can tell by the title, this is an interim PC, and what I mean by that is it is supposed to hold you over by being a base PC until you either are able to get a graphics card that you can afford that fits your needs, or until the GPU prices start dropping so you can get, for example, a 20 or 30 series graphics card. So this PC you'll technically be able to use since we have a GT 710 in there to get a display, but not exactly for gaming. But the main point is you can still build a PC right now. All the parts in this PC are currently reasonably priced, and the build altogether allows for tons of upgrades. Has a high wattage 80 plus gold rated power supply, 4 RAM slots on the motherboard, 2 M2 slots, and 5th generation Ryzen compatibility, etc, etc. Point is, this PC will be the perfect base for all of your future upgrades when you can either get or afford them. Let's get started. Let's kick things off by installing everything onto our motherboard, the MSI MPG X570 Gaming Edge Wi-Fi board. Now this board is not only future-proof, but it also comes with Wi-Fi built in, which I know is a must-have for a good chunk of you guys. Once you have the motherboard placed directly on top of its box or an anti-static surface, you can go ahead and install the CPU, the AMD Ryzen 5 3600. To do this, make sure that the triangle on the bottom left of the chip matches up with the little dot on the bottom left of its socket, and gently install the CPU. Once that's popped in, lower and secure the CPU latch. Next comes the RAM. First things first though, we gotta push open the RAM retention tabs of DIMM A2 and DIMM B2. And then from there, you can install the PNY XLR8 16GB of 3200 MHz DDR4 RAM. The RAM only goes in one way, so make sure that the stickers on the RAM are facing the CPU. And after that comes our first storage device, which does have its own dedicated heatsink, so we do need to remove it before we can install the crucial P2 500GB NVMe SSD. And to secure it in place, we use the super tiny M2 screw that should be included in the motherboard box. And yeah, like I said, it's a super tiny screw, so if you don't have a magnetized screwdriver, you may struggle just a tiny bit. And with that all done, we can put the M2 heatsink right back in its original position, but first be sure to remove this plastic film from the thermal pad. So now at this point, you should have the CPU, RAM, and SSD installed onto the motherboard. And the final piece we have to install onto the motherboard before you install the whole thing into the case is the CPU cooler. And the first step to doing that is removing the 2 included mounting brackets and the backplate. And the specific cooler that we'll be using in this build is the deepcool GameX GT ARGB edition. And besides the heatsink and the fan, these are the only parts you'll be needing to use for its installation. Find all of your hexagon-shaped screws and place them into the slot labeled AM4. And when finished, place the entire assembly where the original CPU backplate was. And if it doesn't want to budge, chances are you put one of the hexagon-shaped screws in the wrong slots. So once again, hexagon-shaped screws go in the AM4 slots. And that's it for the backplate. Now let's get to the pieces that will actually mount our CPU cooler, starting with these white plastic washers. Those slide right on, and on top of them, you'll want to screw on the nuts. Now to fasten these in place, you only need to use your hands. No need to get any special tool to tighten them, just make sure they're as snug as you possibly can get them using your fingers. And before we can install the CPU cooler, we have a couple steps. First, remove the fan by removing these thin metal brackets. I actually had to pull out some pliers because they were being pretty difficult, but either way, do whatever you must to remove this fan, because otherwise we won't be able to screw in the mounting plates. And those are kind of essential if you want to be able to use the cooler. So get the AMD bracket, locate the tiny screw, and get a tiny screwdriver to fasten in both AMD mounting brackets. These are pretty important. Make sure these are nice and snug. And last but not least, before we wrap things up with the CPU cooler, we gotta install the thermal paste on top of the CPU. And for this build, I picked Arctic's brand new MX5 thermal compound, which comes with, of course, the paste and a spatula. And usually I would just do a pea-sized dot in the middle and allow the pressure from the cooler to do the rest. But this time I wanted to try out using the included spatula. All you really gotta do is take the spatula and spread the compound evenly across the top of the CPU. And after you take the sticker off the bottom of the CPU cooler, it's time to get it installed. Yeah, I know, kind of a tedious process, but this is the last step. Place the cooler directly on the CPU so that it comes in alignment with our screw mounts, then get your spring screws. And what I like to do is fasten them just enough so they won't go anywhere. And once you've done that with all 4 spring screws, you can start fastening in an X pattern. So go in the order, for example, top left, bottom left, top right, and keep doing this until all the screws are nice and snug. If you do it too loose, you risk not getting enough thermal contact, and if you do it too tight, you risk damage. So snug is the key word here. And in my opinion, that whole process of installing the CPU cooler is probably the most annoying part, so everything from here is going to be super easy. And don't forget to reinstall the fan that we took off earlier. The metal bracket will have its own inlet on the CPU heatsink itself, which will be used to keep the fan in place. Yeah, unless you bend that metal wire, it's going to hold the fan there for an eternity and no screws needed. And our last step before we put everything in the case, we're going to plug in our CPU fan connector. You can find the proper 4-pin fan connector right above the RAM, and it should be labeled CPU fan 1. And now the case finally comes into the picture, the deepcool MacCube 310. Now you certainly don't need to use this particular case, you can use any ATX case you'd like, but this is a very beginner friendly case and I highly recommend it. Anyway, grab the bag out of the back of the case as it has a bunch of important screws and other things that we'll be using later on. Now unless you're completely insane, I highly recommend that you place the case on its back for the installation of the motherboard. And we're going to remove this back fan real quick for 2 reasons. 1, we're going to be relocating it, and 2, it makes it a lot easier to install the motherboard. And to get this thing positioned, all you need to do is make sure that the IO shield is properly positioned with the IO cutout. That's all it takes. All the screw mounts will be perfectly lined up now. And you can find the motherboard screws included in the bag that was in the back of the case that we just took out. Picture on top right will show you exactly where every screw goes. And with that done, we can get started with our lovely power supply, the Seasonic Focus GX750. It's a modular power supply, so pay attention, we need to get all the right cables in the right slots. With the CPU cable, plug the side labeled PSU anywhere that's labeled CPU/PCIe. Same thing goes for the PCIe power cable. Next up, SATA power connector. It'll look like this, and it plugs into the area labeled peripheral/SATA/Molex. And last but not least, the hard to miss 24-pin power connector. The end of that splits into 2 is what we'll be plugging into the power supply. And this plugs into the area labeled M/B. And that is the last cable that we'll be plugging in for this modular power supply. Now we get to put the power supply into the case. Make sure that the fan is facing the bottom of the case where the vent is. Otherwise the power supply will be getting virtually 0 airflow coming from the fan, and you don't exactly want that to happen. And to fasten the power supply in place, use the 4 included screws that should have came in the power supply box. Oh, also be sure to switch this into hybrid mode. And that's it for the power supply, and now let's install the hard drive. First step would be to remove this screw right here so that we can remove the hard drive bracket. And the hard drive that I chose for this build is the popular, all-reliable Seagate Barracuda 2TB drive. Place the hard drive right on top of the bracket and slide it around a little bit until you find that 4 screw holes become perfectly aligned. And once those screw holes are aligned, you of course are going to want to fasten the hard drive to the hard drive bracket. And you're actually going to be using the same exact screws that we used to install the motherboard into the case. And you certainly don't want to have any loose screws here, as this hard drive has a spinning disc inside of it, so you're going to want to make sure that this thing is nice and secure. And same deal with the screw that fastens the whole assembly back into the case, make sure that's nice and snug. And while we're in this area, let's remove the graphics card support bracket. Super awesome of deepcool to include it, but we simply won't be needing it for this build. But hey, hold on to it. It could definitely come in handy down the road. Okay, now we're gonna get started with plugging some things in. So there's 2 sections of cables, the front panel connectors and the power supply connectors. We're gonna start with the power supply connectors. Starting with the PCIe cable. Now, since we don't have our dream graphics card in this build, we're gonna tuck this away, and when you do finally get your dream graphics card, you can just take this thing out from where we tucked it in and plug it into your, for example, 3060. Next connector that we're going to be dealing with is the SATA power connector. This is going to power our hard drive, and this only goes in one way. Take a look at the header, take a look at the connector, make sure it'll actually fit. And next up is the CPU power cable. This one will go through the cutout on the very top right corner of the case. Now, if you have smaller hands, this probably won't be super difficult for you. And if you have bigger hands, well, all I can say is make sure the clips match up with the notch at the top, and good luck. No, I'm just kidding. It's not that bad, but it might take a little bit of time if you have bigger hands. Next, we have the 24-pin power connector. This one will go through the middle cutout and plugs into the really hard to miss 24-pin header. Now, this may take a little more effort than the other connectors simply because there's so many pins that have to connect, but keep applying even light pressure along all areas of the connector and it'll eventually completely snap into place. Now we're actually going to remove something. We're going to be removing the fan hub that comes included in the case. And now we're going to move on to the front connectors, starting with the HD audio cable. It has a bunch of multicolored wires coming out of it, so it's hard to miss. This will plug into the header on the very bottom left corner of the motherboard, labeled JAUD1. Next is the USB 3.0 cable. This will go through the bottom left cable cutout and will plug into the header labeled USB 3 on the very bottom right corner of the motherboard. Don't worry about all that extra cable sticking out. You don't want to try to tuck it in and risk damaging the motherboard or the connector. And the last front panel cables that we're going to be dealing with, everyone's favorite, the front panel connectors. This, just like the USB 3 cable, is going to go through the bottom left cutout. And all these connectors will go into the header labeled JFP1. I'm not going to take 3 full minutes to show you where each individual front panel connector goes. Just keep in mind that the arrow on the cables indicate positive and the guide is right here on the screen. And now the SATA cable for the hard drive. 2 SATA cables come included with the motherboard box, but we're only going to be using one of them. Plug one end into the hard drive with the metal clip facing up, and as for the other end, slide it through the bottom cutout and plug it into one of the 6 SATA ports. Now it's time to install the deepcool RF120M fans. We're going to start by installing 3 fans in the front, which means we're going to need to remove the front cover. Now for the bottom fan, we're actually going to use the fan that we took out of the back of the case earlier, and the RF120Ms for the middle and the top. And you can find the screws for these fans in their box. And with that done, you can put the front panel back on. And next up, the top fans. You'll need to remove the top panel. This one clicks right off just like the last panel. And then you can start installing your top 2 120mm fans. And make sure that they're installed in this exact direction, otherwise you'll have air blowing in the wrong way. And the last fan will go in the very back of the case. This will also be an outtake fan, so make sure it's installed in this direction. And that's it for fastening the fans into place. Now we need to give them some power. Get one of the fan hubs that was included with the RF120Ms and plug all 3 of the back fans into this hub. Then just adhere the fan hub somewhere convenient. For me, the best spot is right here next to the CPU power cable on the side. And there should be a 4-pin power connector that comes out of this hub. We're gonna plug this into the bottom of the motherboard, so route this through the bottom cable cutout and plug it into any 4-pin fan header that you'd like. And we're going to do the same exact thing for the front 3 fans. Plug them all into the other included fan hub, adhere it somewhere convenient, and route the fan power cable through the bottom and plug it into one of the 4-pin fan headers. And now for the RGB cables. Coming out of every fan we just installed should be a male and female connector that look a little bit like this. You're going to want to interconnect all of them together, which will leave one female connector left over. This leftover female connector will connect to this adapter, which should be included in the RF120M's box. And just like that, all the RGB lights for our case fans are interlinked. Take the other side of the adapter and route it through the top left cable cutout and plug it into the connector labeled JRGB2. Now we're going to deal with the cables that have been sticking out of the CPU cooler this whole time. Take both of them, slide them through the upper cutout, and get them in the back of the case. Connect the male 3-pin to the female 3-pin, and then get the ARGB adapter that should have been included in the motherboard box. Take the male end, plug it into the leftover 3-pin female side coming from the CPU cooler, and then take the ARGB connector and route it through the top left cable cutout. And this will be plugging into the header labeled JRainbow2 at the very top right. And as you can see, we now have all of our RGB devices plugged in. And now for the graphics card. You'll first want to get rid of this bracket by removing the one screw holding it down, and you'll want to remove just one PCIe slot cover, the one second from the top. Now you can go and grab your glorious, amazing GT710 or whatever temporary graphics card that you're using, push it into the PCIe slot, and use the same screw that we removed from the PCIe slot cover to fasten it into place. Put both of the side panels back on, and the PC should be ready to boot. Oh, and one final step here, we got to put on the Wi-Fi antennas. These are in the motherboard box, and they screw right onto the motherboard I/O. And that wraps up the tutorial segment of this video. Now let's check out how to install Windows and drivers. So to install Windows, we're going to be using the Windows ISO method. So what you'll need to do is boot up a separate PC, get yourself an at least 8GB USB drive, and plug it into said PC. Head over to Microsoft's Download Windows 10 page and click Download Tool Now. Once it's downloaded, you can run the Media Creation tool. It'll start by saying it's getting a few things ready. This will take a little bit under a minute. Then you can brush up on your Microsoft software license terms and accept. It'll then do a little bit more loading until it prompts you with the what do you want to do, and you should click Create Installation Media. Make sure the edition and architecture are Windows 10 and 64-bit, and the language is your language of preference. Click Next, and then make sure USB flash drive is selected, and then click Next. The USB flash drive that you have plugged into your PC should come up, select it, and then click Next. It will then download Windows 10 onto that USB, and once it's finished downloading onto the USB drive, we can plug it into our brand new PC and boot it up. You should be greeted by the Windows installation prompt. We'll be putting in the activation code later, so click I don't have a product key. Then click Windows 10 Home or Windows 10 Pro, then click Next. Familiarize yourself with the software license terms, click I accept the license terms, and then click Next. Then select Custom Install Windows Only. Then click the SSD, which should be the 500GB drive. Select it and click Next, and then it will finally install Windows 10 onto your PC. With Windows successfully installed and set up, it's time to activate XMP, boot your PC, and spam the delete key to boot to BIOS. Click XMP Profile 1, which will allow your RAM to run at its maximum allowed speed. Then click the X at the top right and click Yes to save and exit. Now let's activate Windows. Head over to digitalchillmart.com, the best place to get Windows 10 license keys. Once purchased, the key will be emailed to you immediately. Link to Digital Chill Mart will be in the description. Now head over to Activation Settings. You can just search it up on your Windows search bar, and once you make it there, click on the button that prompts you to put in your activation key, and that's where you'll want to put in the key that you received from Digital Chill Mart. And last but not least, the drivers. So I'm not going to walk you guys through every step in order to install the drivers, as all you really got to do is click the download button and click next a couple of times. But I will have every link that you'll need for all the drivers in my description. And now, finally, for the benchmarks. So for the benchmarks, I decided to test this PC out with an RX 5700 XT, which should be a rough equivalent to the RTX 3060 or the 2070 in terms of performance. All right, no more commentary from here, just gonna play some nice soothing music in the background. Enjoy, guys. All right, so that'll wrap it up for this video, guys. If you enjoyed the video, drop a like. Have any comments or questions, drop a comment below or shoot me an email. You can find my email in the description of the video. And if you enjoy the content that you're seeing, drop a sub. It really helps out the channel and I deeply appreciate it. If you plan on building this or have built it, let us know in the comment section. The community and I would love to hear about it. Thanks for watching. Peace out.